Okay, so I love the fact that people are sending me games now. But this disc is like, you can't even tell what's on here. Like, I mean, all it has is this tiny little label, and all it says is self-extracting files, goo bon pcm revlog flawwall, run from hard disk only, for instructions type run this. How are you supposed to tell what's on here? Like, there's no copyright, there's no author information. Though, that's strange word. Like, I mean, every third letter is capitalized. So, you know, I guess it could be like different programs or something, or... Oh, wait a minute. Goo bone. Could it mean Google bonus? Could this disc have the Google bonus games on it? Really?
Oh, yes. Okay guys, today on Ancient DOS Games, we're going to be taking a look at something I never thought I'd see again for the rest of my life. The Google bonus disc games. Now scroll back about 2 decades to when I was still in elementary school, and one of the schools I attended had both the Google math games as well as the registered bonus disc games for play in their computer lab. And I gotta tell you, since most of the other decent games at that school, like The Incredible Machine and Treasure Mountain, only had single licenses instead of site licenses, once a couple students got into those games, the Google Math games were pretty much the only ones anyone ever played. And if I recall correctly, most of us spent a lot more time with the bonus games than we did with the other ones. However, for the longest time, this thing had pretty much disappeared off the face of the earth, and not even illegitimate download sites had this thing. That's how rare and unknown this program is. So imagine my delight when a fan just casually emails me and asks, "By the way, you still looking for the Google bonus disc?" I mean, really, that was freaking awesome in its own right. But now, I not only get to prove to the internet that this thing exists, but I also get to show you guys how good it is. Well, okay, let me rephrase that. The Google bonus disc games are pretty good, but they're also really simple, so there's not much to say about each of them. But for the most part, they're much better designed than the games included in the normal Google Math Games package. Plus, there's 6 of them, so we've got a lot of ground to cover, more or less. The Google bonus disc games were originally created and released by Paul T. Dawson at or around the same time as the Google Math games in 1989, though the version I've got here is from 1995 and has many functional enhancements over the original. At least I would assume that, given how the earlier versions of the Google Math games play. This thing can also best be described as a one-player minigame collection, since unlike the original Google Math games, which all had sort of an arcade feel to them, not all of the games in this collection are like that, just most of them. Again, just like the Google Math games, they were originally made specifically for CGA 320 by 200 4-color graphics, but later versions have EGA support, which doesn't actually improve the color fidelity, rather it just makes it possible to adjust the colors used to any of those found in the 16-color EGA palette. As for audio, it's limited to the PC speaker. As for its current release date, the game's still commercial, and finding a copy, legal or not, is probably going to be impossible. The fact that I've got a copy of this now is kind of a miracle in its own right, and I'll probably be figuring out how to get this thing officially archived shortly after this video goes live. Before I get into the 6 games available on this disc, there's a couple quick things to mention. First is that the explanation system from the original Google Math games is not present here. I think the author kind of realized that the explanation system really didn't do anything to make these games any better. And let's face it, most of the kids who played the original Google Math games didn't even realize there was an explanation system in the first place. And secondly, there's 2 features I neglected to talk about before. One lets you adjust how big the numbers will get, so you can sort of limit the complexity of any math equation shown to an extent, while another lets you pull up a surprisingly interactive boss screen. Just in case you're an adult playing these things on company time at the office and your boss is coming around to see what kind of progress you're making on your TPS reports. Now, let's talk about the games themselves in the order they're presented, starting with Clash. This is actually the only game in the package that has absolutely nothing to do with math. You control a green smiley face leaving trails, while a yellow bug also leaves trails trying to run into you. You're able to move 2 spaces at a time, but you can only move in 4 directions, up, down, left, and right, whereas the bug only moves a single space at a time, but can also move diagonally. The goal is simply to last as long as you can without running into any of the yellow trails left behind, though touching your own trails or the walls is perfectly okay. The game's actually kind of a throwaway since there's no skill settings or anything, and I think it would have been better if it actually did have multiple skill settings, as well as a score counter actively being shown, cause as it stands, you can't tell what your score is until the game's over. Next up, we have Multiplication Table Frenzy. Now this game is kind of neat. The idea is that you control a cursor on a multiplication table and are given a number. You have to move your cursor as quickly and with as few moves as possible onto any spot on the table where that number would be, revealing every number you move across in the process. Once you've uncovered 10 target numbers, the game is over and your final score will be equal to your time remaining minus the number of moves you made. This actually makes scoring in this game incredibly competitive and does a really good pick given a social environment like a computer lab in an elementary school. In fact, this was one of the more popular games because of this. Don't really have any complaints about this one. Next up is Lander. Now, this game's kind of hit and miss. Quite literally, actually. The idea is that you have a space lander with 500 fuel units and a number shown on its faceplate. The goal is to land on the equation which equates to that number. Each time you pull this off, you get some points, and once you make a mistake or run out of fuel units, the game is over. Fuel units are lost every time you have to fire your thrusters, and you can fire them in any direction you want, adding a unit of speed towards the opposite direction, i.e. fire the left thrusters and you'll be generating rightward motion. In terms of what this game does right, it's not possible to lose by touching the outer edges of the playfield. You simply bounce off of them. In fact, taking advantage of these bounces can help save fuel, because if you want to get the highest scores possible, you have to be very patient and you have to conserve every bit of fuel you can. It's also interesting that every once in a while, you'll actually see 2 equations that can both be accepted as the right answer. So the game's not trying to trick you, but rather make you realize that either option's acceptable. Where this game fails, though, is the actual landing process. Those of you who've played Lunar Lander style games know that you want to touch down with virtually no horizontal momentum and as little vertical momentum as possible. Here, you don't have that restriction. You just have to touch the correct equation. But therein lies the tricky aspect, is that you don't actually land the whole way down. You stop short by a number of pixels, so it's hard to know where the acceptable range is, since if you're just slightly outside of the center area marked by the spikes, it counts as a miss and ends the game. I think it would have been better if each equation actually had a platform above it you could land on with a margin of error, so that if you did miss by a couple pixels, the game would still count it. Yeah, well, the game's not bad, but it could have been better. Next up is Defender, and this is the quintessential game of the pack, and the one that was played the most back when I was a kid. The game is very similar to Google Vaders from the original Google Math games, except instead of being vertically aligned, it's horizontally aligned, and instead of having 12 fire buttons, you only have 2. T and F for true and false. To destroy an advancing equation, simply figure out if it's true or false and fire the appropriate beam. If you make a mistake, the enemy advances and you lose some points. If any enemies advance all the way to the left side of the screen, the game is over. Right off the bat, there's 2 important things of note. One is that this game can go on forever, even once it reaches quote-unquote ludicrous speed. Possibly a nod to Spaceballs, but I have no way to confirm that. The thing is, though, that even ludicrous speed isn't all that ridiculous, but to survive, you really have to be on your A game the whole time. The other thing that's nice is that once you do get up to full speed, those robots that would normally interrupt the gameplay with positive reinforcement no longer show up at all, since let's face it, once you get going that fast, chances are you won't want any interruptions at all. Next up is a 15-tile sliding puzzle game. Yeah, this was sort of the black sheep of the bunch, and virtually no one played this thing. Me personally, I'm not actually that bad at sliding puzzles. I'm not that great, but I can always solve them given enough time. So, it is what it is, take it or leave it. I should note though that the scoring here is exactly the same as in Multiplication Table Frenzy. Once the puzzle is solved, your score will be equal to your time remaining minus the number of moves you made. The final game is Gulper, and this is kind of a weird one, but still interesting. The idea is that you're trying to gulp down numbers on a playfield. Each number you gobble up adds to a running total, and you have a target number you need to reach without going over. When you hit this target number, it's added to your score, and you're given a new playfield and a new target number. You also start with 500 moves. Once you run out of moves or accidentally go over your current target number, the game ends. There's nothing really bad about this game except for one major flaw, and it specifically has to do with the high score system. And in fact, half of the games in this program have this problem. The high scores are not affected by any difficulty considerations. With Clash, Multiplication Table Frenzy, and the Slider Puzzle, this isn't a consideration since there's no difficulty selections for those. Defender does allow you to choose your starting speed, but since most of the points you earn will be at the maximum speed, this isn't really that big a deal. With the other two games, though, this generalized scoring penalizes anyone playing with higher difficulty settings. On Lander, you can select what kind of equations to get, but regardless of what kinds of equations you allow, each one will always be worth 10 points. Here in Gulper, the fast speed drains your moves faster, and it's a lot harder to track just what numbers you should be going for because of the extra speed. So scores made in the lower speed settings will always be higher than the ones made in the higher speed settings. So there's really no point to play the game on the higher speeds. This could have easily been counterbalanced by simply doubling the scores at each speed rating, but that's not what's happening here, so oh well. I think this is a case where nostalgia remembered this thing a lot more fondly than it actually was. Which isn't to say the Google bonus disc games are bad, since they're actually still pretty fun to play for the most part. They just could have used a little more tweaking to get them balanced just right for a classroom environment, especially the scoring systems. And considering this thing has pretty much been lost to the clutches of time, there's really not much point in complaining, I guess, but hopefully some people still remember this thing exists, and now that I have a copy of it myself, if I ever get the okay from Paul Dawson to put this thing out there for other people to play, I'm fully capable of doing so. If that day ever comes, or if by some stroke of luck you have access to these games and want to give them a go again on a modern system, then all you have to do is set a fixed cycles count in DOSBox. After a lot of tweaking, I found a cycle setting of 1700 to be ideal. Any less, and certain elements of the program start to become noticeably slow. Any more, and certain elements of the gameplay in Defender and Gulper become uncomfortably fast. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Episode 137 will be on Saturday, May 3rd, and as for what game I'll be covering, well, how many DOS games can you think of which had so much content it needed to span across 4 CDs? Yeah, that's what I thought. So you'd better send in your guess to adg@pixelships.com and stay tuned to see if a DOS game requiring that much raw data is actually any decent.